This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The Archives.
Episode 401. Cheap news is bad news.
Oh, I think they can be a great force for good still and do a lot of things. And I think, they've just got to change their business model. And that's what we're about. We're thinking about that very hard and, in fact, working on it and going forward. If the advertising is going to decline, and it has declined, a lot of it, like small ads, I don't think will come back. We have to look to our readers to pay us more. So we have to get the better products. We have to have digital versions which we charge for properly.
This is the Debunking Economics Podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
Well, that was Rupert Murdoch giving a rare interview, but it was to the Wall Street Journal, which he owns, and it was over 10 years ago, talking about how there's less advertising and more subscriptions was the way forward for the media. What he probably wasn't reckoning on was a decade dominated by social media and less consumption of news generally. So is there a future for journalism, or is it market failure? And is there a market failure argument that says government needs to do more and get more involved, or does that make things worse? That's this week on the Debunking Economics Podcast. Now, I had no idea that media economics is a thing. You can even take a degree in it. And there's a journal of media economics, which has been around since 1988. So let's take all those decades of that good work and that 3 years of undergraduate study and condense it into a 30 or maybe 40-minute podcast under the headline banner of what future is there for a media industry. I mean, I'm a media guy, Steve's an economist, so we can do a bit of media economics, surely. Because here's the thing, whether you agree with The Sun or not, and obviously it is a bit of a trashy paper, but 3.5 million people used to buy a copy of it every week in the year 2000. In 2020, that was 1.2 million. In the same year, The Guardian has a circulation of just 132,000. In 2000, it was over 400,000. So we're seeing this massive fall. 3/4 of the entire circulation of these newspapers is falling. Sometimes as much as 90% has dropped away. And that direction is still heading down. So try buying a paper at all in the United States. In fact, the combined average daily print circulation of the 25 biggest dailies in the US was 2.6 million in 2023. So that is 1 in every 120 people in the country buying a newspaper. And those circulation numbers were 14% down in 1 year. So yes, newspapers are a dead duck. The biggest earners are the news organisations on TV like Comcast, which owns MSNBC and CNBC and Sky News in the UK, which has a market cap of 186 billion. Reuters, with a 58 billion market cap, that's all a News Corp, well down the list. This is just the newspaper and TV part of the whole news organisation, not the movies and all that sort of stuff. News Corp, well down the list with a market cap of 12 billion. They all compare to Netflix with a market cap of 247 billion without the expense of creating all that throwaway daily news. I mean, they make something and stick it in the catalogue. So you look at all of that, Steve, and you go, how can anyone ever expect to make money out of news?
Yeah, and it was a totally different world when you and I were young men because, for example, just a simple physical illustration again of that, being a Sydney-sider, I read the Sydney Morning Herald, and when it came on a Saturday, I think there were about either 4 or 6 folios of it. And we're talking a broadsheet newspaper, so you could basically wallpaper your house with each weekly edition of the Saturday Sydney Morning Herald, and even the weekday was massively thick. Probably, I'm only guessing how many pages it might be, but it would not have been unusual to be up to 100 pages. And now I doubt that it would crack 30 as a physical paper. So there's been a huge decline in the revenue and the quality, of course, of media, of journalism as a result.
Yeah. Well, there was a show on, because of course it's all moving online, but even there it's struggling because of the fighting for the advertising dollar, and the advertising dollar is going to social media because there's just so many more hits. And then the BBC has been cut to oblivion as well in the UK. So there's a show I've just watched called Scoop, which is about Newsnight and how he managed to get Prince Andrew to agree to be interviewed about his friendship with Epstein. This was the big gotcha interview that basically where he came up with all sorts of crazy stuff, like saying, well, it can't have been me because I was at a pizza restaurant that date, and I don't think the date had even been mentioned at that stage. And this girl who was saying he was sweating on the dance floor, and he was saying, well, it can't be me because I don't sweat. I've got this special disease that means, it was just, frankly, it was just embarrassing. And it was, it basically showed that, someone who was in line for the throne, okay, a long way down the line for the throne, but, one of the Queen's children was hanging around with paedophiles or a paedophile. And it was a revelation. And so this show called Scoop I think it's a Netflix show, actually, ironically, about how Newsnight lined all of that up. Now, Netflix, did a good job of that. Newsnight obviously did a great job of that interview, but it won't happen again. No more Scoops because Newsnight, which has been running for 44 years, is being canned by the BBC because they can't afford to do it anymore.
It's been a tragedy all the way through, and as it happened back in my, let's go back to say when you would regard the internet as actually starting, which is sort of around the 1990 point, so 35 years ago, you started getting the very beginning of online advertising, and the thing that kept newspapers alive, they used to call them, the term was the rivers of gold, and that was the classified news advertisements. So forget about the actual part you decide to read for politics and science and anything else you're interested in. It was all the ads of people selling their second-hand television set that actually kept the money ticking through, and of course particularly real estate ads. So there was, with the rivers of gold, what you had was an absolutely, compared to today, absolutely brilliantly resourced news service sitting above it. So way back in I've got to remember the actual dates because it's so long ago in my past, but in about would have been in the 1977 to 1980. I ran a series of workshops for journalists on foreign news coverage, and the concept at that stage I was working for an overseas aid organisation called Freedom from Hunger, and we had a library which is called the Ideas Centre, very woke term, and the concept behind the seminars was to have journalists from different countries read what was written about their country by journalists in the other country. So we did a comparative study, first of all, of how the collapse of India's then Janata Party occurred, and Indira Gandhi came back after everybody had written her off and won the election after the Janata, which means People's Party, won once more. And then I followed that up with taking a group of Australian journalists to China for the first ever conference that Chinese journalists had with journalists from any other country. And what I did, and this is with the backing of the Australia-China Council, I, with the help of an ex-school student of mine who's now a professor of media studies, of all things, in Melbourne, I went through every newspaper in the country and cut out and then classified every article on China over 1 year. Now that generated a 6-volume set I'd say that this number of pages of paper that was of Australia's coverage of China in 1 year was something like 2,000 or 3,000 pages of paper. And it was huge. And we then broke it down to the 6 major topics. So economics, politics, agriculture was in there as a topic as well. I've forgotten the other 2, foreign affairs, whatever. And we then met around a conference room in Beijing and went through Australia's coverage on those 6 topics of China and China's coverage of Australia on those 6 topics as well in its nascent news media. Now, just the reason for that long ramble is that to build the actual database of news coverage, I had to go to Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, The Australian, all the leading newspapers in Australia, and get their clipping files and photocopy the clipping files and put those together. And there was an entire, in each newspaper there was a library which would keep track of all the newspaper articles, classify them and so on, quite a substantial librarian staff, and then leading parts of the newspaper would have their own research team. So this is what used to be news. And And when the internet came along, we'll talk about, as we go through the show, all that was cut because the rivers of gold were cut off, the advertising went online, and the media organisations never worked out a way to fight that, and have just plunged in readership and equally plunged in the quality of the research they can do.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been a long time, it's shifting what has been a long time presence. So the Times, for example, is 239 years old. I think when it started, its classified ads were on the front page.
Yeah, you look at your old newspapers there, and you'll see that there are and this is what we had a great Australian media journalist called Humphrey McQueen. Ever heard of him?
No.
Okay. Fantastically colourful character. We had him give a lecture at Western Sydney. This is back in the early 90s when I was there, late 90s. And Humphrey said that if you sit back and after a day of reading the newspaper and watching the TV, you feel tired, it's because you've been working. You are the product. Okay. It isn't that you bought the TV or you bought the newspaper. The newspaper was selling you to advertisers, and that was the whole focus. And, of course, the advertising was what kept the newspaper alive. And when the internet came along, the thing which was obvious to me at the time, because I was actually working in computing at the same time, is they had to work out a system of micropayments. Because you would fork out, in today's terms, you would pay $2.50 or $3 a day for your newspaper coverage. And then what would you continue doing that if you could actually access for free the content of some newspapers overseas for your foreign news coverage and so on? And no, you would not. So they started losing both readership and revenue from classified ads, and that was the death knell of decent journalism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it has to go to the subscription model, doesn't it? And some newspapers are doing better than others at that. But, yeah, I think your point about the idea of micropayments is, what if I don't want to subscribe to the Times, but they have an interesting article that I want to read? Shouldn't I just be able to pay to read that one article? And I guess they'd say, well, yeah, no, but we want you to pay for that one article and then subscribe to us and then forget you've got that subscription so we can keep on pulling, because that's the way it works, isn't it? You subscribe to these things and then you lose track of what you subscribe to, and that's how they make their money.
Yeah, and I subscribed for quite some time to the Sydney Morning Herald, the New York Times, and the Guardian. And I didn't need to subscribe to the Guardian because they had an open system. I got annoyed at it, and I was thinking, I had to economise at some point. Financial difficulties struck, and I stopped paying for the Guardian. And what you had is the open system was relying upon trust, which is not a particularly strong product these days.
So you chose to abuse that trust?
I chose to abuse that trust, yeah. But the New York Times and the Sydney Morning Herald I continued paying because I wanted access. Partly it was actually having a war with Paul Krugman, so I needed to be able to maintain access to his blogs. And they charge $5 a month for that, and it's much the same for the Sydney Morning Herald. But if you go to read some, like for example, the Washington Post, you'll see something put up on Twitter and you want to read the article in the Washington Post, and bang, you've got to subscribe for the paywall. Now, I ages ago subscribed to a service called Inkl, INKL, and that's a news aggregation service, and that was the closest I ever saw to them getting the micropayments worked out. And what they should have done is you'd subscribe to some, and this is where a certain level of monopolisation is vital. You would subscribe to a service called, I wouldn't use the word news because that's associated with Rupert Murdoch. And can I put a little joke in here at the moment?
Yeah, if you want. Yeah.
Okay,
I don't think we're crying out for humour on this podcast.
They are indeed. It's pretty dull, really. Anyway, Murdoch, of course, has always been an absolutely responsible and trustworthy source that nobody ever criticises. So the arsehole was involved in some struggle with the journalists, and they were trying to come up with this. The left, the progressive parties were trying to come up with a slogan against it, and I came up with a slogan, which is, what was it, Ken? Murdoch is bad news. So that was fun. But so there were political struggles inside the newspapers as well. So the management wanted to minimise the cost of the journalist and maximise the revenue. They were focused on all that stuff, and they completely let slip the idea of building up a micro payment system. But if you had to subscribe to some generic service, which I'd call info, let's call it info. Then
so what you're talking about is like a Spotify for news. isn't it?
Something
Really?
like that. Yeah. You subscribe to Info, and then let's say you put in $30, $1 a day, which would be a reasonable rate, and then you would read. You might read 13 articles from the New York Times, 27 from the Times of London, 45 from the Sydney Morning Herald, blah blah blah, and then they would cut up. That would then change what your $30 went to. That to me was a simple system to do. Nobody ever did it. So Incal came along and they provide aggregation of some of the news sources. I'm paying $15 a month, I think it was, I used to pay, something of that scale for Incal as well. But what it means is it's such a fragmented system. You've got all these fiefs you can't break into, and consequently the quality of journalism has plunged.
Yeah, but you see, I think the reason why that's not happened is because the newspapers would say, well, we are a brand. We curate the news. We want people to subscribe and take our whole experience. Just as you used to buy a copy of whatever newspaper you buy at the weekend. We want that experience replicated online. So we don't want to water that down. We want you to pay for all of our articles. If you don't read them all, that's your problem. But we'd rather you're stuck with us rather than just dipping in for one or two stories. I mean, so it's all about share of wallet. They want to get the maximum out of you that they can. They don't want to have that disaggregated by having to pay or losing money to you paying to see some other stories in their competition.
But that was the problem. Their bland rivalry, which was fierce, as you'd know from those days of journalism. I'll give you some anecdotes of my experience of that. But that was fierce competition over getting a story. The whole idea of a scoop, you mentioned earlier. That was the dream of an academic, is to get some new research result nobody has had before, and prove some new theorem or eliminate some old belief and so on. The dream of a journalist was to get that story first, and the rivalry between different newspapers was huge. So what would happen in the morning, and every newspaper on the planet pretty much, what are called the sub-editors would get all the various newspapers together of that particular day and look through the news stories. And if there was a story which another newspaper got which you didn't got, there was hell to pay. Why didn't we get that story?
Yeah, and you'd be looking for your angle to follow it and steal the story back.
Yeah,
but the problem is the scoop these days is that you can spend a lot of money trying to get that scoop, but the audience will follow you on social media, probably increasingly, and that scoop is either shared or reshared, often out of context, by people or by organizations who made no effort to secure that scoop. So that is the problem, isn't it? That's the real danger, that the people are making money. The people are the Facebooks of the world, the Metas of the world, who are allowing the resharing of stories which are seen in the context of ads that they are reaping the revenue from, and the publishers aren't getting anything for it. And that's and that is the real problem. People under 24, numerous surveys now showing where did they get their news from? They get it from social media. They don't even bother going to the websites of the mainstream media.
Yeah, and I'm slightly over the age group, but that's the same thing I do as well. I do read the occasional newspaper, but I get most of my information by reading through Twitter and other, mainly Twitter, but some other social media. And the brand rivalry of the newspapers, with fierce brand rivalry, stopped them inventing something like Twitter themselves. So that's what they should have done. You put the articles there, you're all out and competing, and then the emphasis would have been on quality journalism and scoops, rather than the trivia that comes out of them these days, where they're completely unresearched. And now what you get mainly, you'll get your news coming out of somebody's photograph of a flood in the Sichuan province, which turns up on Twitter, and then you'll see a journalist saying, "Can we use that photograph? Can we use that?"
Because they're going down the clickbait road, because they've got nowhere else to go, because they have to compete for clickbait, because that's the only way they're going to get any views.
But they don't even have any journalists in those locations. This is the other problem. So in the old days, I don't know how many Sydney Morning Herald in terms of foreign correspondents, but it would have been certainly like 20 or so countries they would have had a foreign correspondent in, and often with a team backing them up. So all that's gone. And then what the knowledge of what is news is no longer something which is part of the paraphernalia of reading information and news, and we get this is where the whole idea of fake news has come from to some extent.
Because there's no one actually doing the reporting. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it? If we're all sharing news on social media, and news organisations aren't making any money out of originating the news in the first place, then you are sharing stories which are probably created, as you say, just by somebody looking through a Twitter feed and finding a pretty weak story, or even worse, not even a person, artificial intelligence creating that story. So where is the origin of stories coming from? It's disappearing, and that's a threat to democracy, isn't it? It means we are living a lie, basically, because there's no one there outsourcing the truth.
Yeah, and you can get AI makes it possible to make the news up these days as well, artificial news stories, and what's actually happened. The major shift that I've seen as well is that back in the up to the 90s, it was commercial enterprises that mainly put out the news, and you also had organisations like the Australian Broadcasting Commission, BBC. Government sources as well. After the internet grew, the private organisations no longer had that cash cow, the rivers of gold were gone, but the governments could still continue funding their organisations. And now you have Al Jazeera, Press TV, a range of different news services, China, Global TV Network, etc., etc. And I've seen people complaining about that and saying, you're reading government propaganda. That's a result of the failure of the commercial system that we're in this situation in the first place. And my approach, of course, is to read multiple of those government source ones to get, try to do the nuancing myself. But that's not exactly common behaviour.
No, it's not. Well, it's interesting watching Al Jazeera to get one side of the whole story about what's going on in Palestine and Israel, of course. You have to treat, a lot of this with a pinch of salt. But it is good to do it, isn't it? Because so long as you understand the biases that are there, I guess just the same as you read Murdoch papers and you understand that the bias that's sitting behind those as well. But look, there is a failing though going on, and it's a dangerous situation that we find ourselves in. Is there a way around it? When we come back, I want to look at the idea that newspapers used to be there to hold people to account. And that's not happening now, and it's not happening because of commercial pressures and economics. So is it a failing of the economic system? So we'll look at that when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast. Me and Steve, back in a moment.
This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
So, Steve, I guess one of the big issues is without people sort of making sure that governments are behaving the way they should be, then governments will try and get away with all sorts. Corruption becomes rife. But if you have a trusted media that can sort out that corruption, it can be rooted out and reported on, then that's a good thing. So there's an organisation called Transparency International. They compile the Corruption Perceptions Index. I'm not sure if you've come across this before, but basically to be top of the list, it means that there is a low belief from the population that the country that you live in is corrupt. So in 2023, Denmark, Finland, New Zealand and Norway were all at the top. We'll ignore the fact that Singapore comes next, which does make you question the methodology a little bit. But well down the list, in equal 20th place, is the UK, just above the United States and Barbados. If you go back 10 years, the UK wasn't in 20th place, it was 14th. 10 years before that, it was 11th. So we've gone from 11th to 20th. And you can't help thinking, well, a reason for that is because the media has just become less effective over those 2 decades.
And you've got a particular political actor, I think his name might be Rupert, who is intervening and using the media as a means of power. And I've seen another anecdote I can give about seeing the power of Murdoch and the way that he threw that power around. So that has meant that it's all about clickbait. It used to be titbait, now it's clickbait, but getting people's attention and then sensationalising stories, but also having a definite political slant. wanting to get both sides of politics to come across and support him. So that's massively corrupted the news service around the world. And again, it isn't just that the commercial media lost out because of the loss of the cash cows from the rivers of classified gold. It's also the behaviour of Murdoch, which is a continuation of the old newspaper barons we used to get out of the days of the Hearst Empire and so on in the United States. And Murdoch's ruthlessness has really damaged the entire media system in at least three major countries, two major, one minor, the UK, America, and Australia. And with that damage, I mean, there's no wonder you don't trust the media. You're being fed a whole set of lines to destroy one side of politics and promote another by a media organisation which has outlets all over the damn country. And it's a cesspool these days compared to what it was back in the 90s.
But how do you control that? How do you stop that happening? I mean, it's a commercial operation. You'd say, well, okay, he should be allowed to make money. He's giving people what they want.
I was actually working with not directly, but cooperating with the Australian Journalists Association way back in the 90s. And my argument was the only way you can actually avoid this sort of politically corrupt individual getting to the top of organisation and then distorting the news to suit his own side was to have strong newspaper unions, where the journalists would collaborate around a code of conduct, which the journalists had, about honesty and integrity in media, and be able to fight off and not lose their jobs if they took on the boss. But that never happened. So, like one other anecdote, when I was trying to organise that conference in China, we charged each of the media organisations that sent along a rep $2,500, roughly $2,500 US. Now that's way back in 1981, 82. So we're talking more than 40 years ago. So it's a substantial amount of money, but it was a damn good deal. So the Australia-China Council put some of the cost up, and so did the media organisations. Now I got the day the letter went out, the next day back came the $2,500 checks and the nominees from each of the newspapers, except the Australian, which turned us down. And this is a long anecdote. Let me get away with this one. Before that, I'd been involved in the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal was established in the 80s, and its idea was that the radio and television spectrum is a public resource, so organisations had to be vetted every 3 years that they were treating a public resource properly, and then the reaction of the media enterprise to that was just to take an incredible attack on anybody who was potentially taking away their ownership of that public resource or their control of that. And I think there must have been about 100 submissions made, and only one of them made it through to really damage or potentially damage the news organisations, and that was mine. Not just me alone, done with people from the Australian Catholic Relief, Australian Council of Churches, Community Aid Abroad, which is now part of Oxfam. So what we did, we decided to do a very detailed analysis of how the newcomer on the block in Australia, Channel 10, which was at that time owned by Murdoch, how they treated the invasion of, how they treated foreign news for 1 week. So we set up to do a really detailed survey, and as luck would have it, the week we chose to do the survey was the week that Vietnam chose to invade Cambodia. So we did our trial run survey, and we now had a detailed timesheet and how many minutes spent on this and what the topic was and who was interviewed and so on, all done by hand watching the TV. And we noticed on our first trial run, nothing on about Cambodia being invaded by Vietnam yet. And we kept on going. I think it was a 10-day survey we did. And on the last day of the survey, 10 days in, finally, 2 things happened. Phnom Penh fell and Channel 10 reported it. So suddenly out of the blue, having done nothing for 9 days, on day 10, bang, here's this huge North story. And if you'd been watching only Channel 10 for your news, you wouldn't even know the invasion had started. So we had them by the balls, basically. And the media organisations completely intimidated the chairman, who was Bruce Gyngell, who was the very first person on Australian TV. He ultimately found... Yeah. Do you know Bruce Gyngell? Did you know Bruce?
No. I know of him.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Well, he founded SBS after that, the Special Broadcast Broadcasting Service, which was the ethnic equivalent of the Australian Broadcasting Commission, so brought out programs in all the various languages of people who were migrants to Australia, which is a fabulous service. And he had been bashed about by these media sides for all the other submissions. All the others were knocked out, and he said ours was the one that was going to win. I know from people talking inside SBS afterwards that and the Australian Broadcasting Commission, that when our submission turned up, he actually marched through the ABC offices waving, but said, "This is what we wanted from the public." Well, along comes Murdoch's henchman, and here's our study, showing that they didn't even cover, and they're trying to defend themselves. And Gyngell finally thinks he can push back with something, so he's making it very obvious that unless they have a decent answer for this, Channel 10 is going to lose its license. Guess who turned up in the room the next day?
Murdoch.
Indeed, Murdoch has arrived. Murdoch was in the room, and he actually insisted the room be cleared. He sat at the very back of the room, and there's about 15 rows of benches towards where the legally oriented bench for the commissioners was, and he sat at the back. I was right next to the door, so I could see him do this. And there he is. He's leaning forward and intimidating Gyngell, whom of course he knew from the media. And he said, "Okay, take my license off me. You can do that." He said, "But I own the building. I own the tower. You take it off me, I'll demolish the building. I'll demolish the tower. Somebody else have to build." It was incredible seeing this display of force.
Yeah, and that's the issue, isn't it? But there's another issue. Issue as well, which Murdoch does, and you can understand why he does it. And it is this, that running a news business as a commercial business. And I've seen it in radio circles, in talk radio circles, which is, I've not really worked in publishing, but certainly done quite a bit in radio. It's easier to dumb down than it is to explain stuff in detail.
Oh, yeah.
And if you're in a situation where you can run ads by just repeating stuff that's simple to grasp, even if it's only half the story and therefore half the truth, then people get it and they keep listening or they keep reading. If you have to say, well, yes, but it's not that straightforward, and then you start to muddy the waters by introducing complexity, or what's that other word, reality, into the situation, then people get confused.
Oh, no, you make up reality TV. That's easy. We have so much reality these days.
We get a lot of it.
And stuff
but news is the ultimate reality. But but explaining it. So explaining the Vietnam War, for example, well, it's complicated, isn't it, in the early days, and hence his decision not to spend a lot of time reporting on it. And that's the problem. It's the simplicity of an easy story, and one that will elicit a response, one that'll make people angry or make people scared. I mean, they're they will push buttons.
And that's what Murdoch has been perfect at. So, and have you seen Hugh Grant is now being paid an enormous amount of money, as in his words, to not pursue the defamation case, and the defamation laws let that happen, because if Hugh's offered even 1 cent less than he was offered
in the settlement, that's right.
In the settlement, he's got to pay legal costs both sides. So that's what Murdoch has used. He's used it. But I'll finish off. There's one little punchline to that anecdote. Having seen his behaviour in person, the fact that I wasn't getting anybody from the Australian to sign up to my conference in China was a sign to me that Murdoch had said, "Here's the ceiling. You don't spend any more than that." And so Mahogany Row, which is the nickname that the journalist gave to the management section inside the Australia at Holt Street down in Sydney, Mahogany Row would have seen this and basically said, "No, turn it down." So at the time, Geoffrey Blaney, who was a very high intellect but right-wing politically, was a good friend of Murdoch's. He was also the chairman of the Australia-China Council. So I said to the person running, the bureaucrat running us, Jocelyn Shea, "I'm sure if we write a letter to Blaney and he tells Murdoch about this event, which Murdoch would not have heard about, I'll have a check on my desk the next day." I wrote the letter, signed by Geoffrey Blaney. This is back in the days when you sent physical letters. Sent off to New York. 1 day later, I had a $2,500 check on my table from the Australian. So the extent to which he intimidated and perverted what was covered by his journalists. It was a sense of
because of
terror
his power
in how you were treated inside the newspaper. Yeah, power, sheer raw power, which he had absolutely no qualms about displaying. Right. And as I saw that I wish I had a TV crew filming Murdoch while I saw him intimidate the Australian Broadcasting Tribunal.
But it's interesting in that they're not the biggest player in the block. Comcast is that much.
Not by a long shot.
Comcast is much bigger, and Comcast. But look at the figure who they get dwarfed by. So Comcast has a net worth of 186 billion. I think I said that earlier. But Meta has a market cap of $1.25 trillion. And and so the power of these, and I said how a lot of people are getting their news from Facebook. In fact, Ofcom asked, which is the regulator in the UK, asked young people aged 16 to 24 where they got their news from. 71% said so they access their news from social media. But these platforms are not generally paying for the news they carry. The media companies will post the stories, or people will share it in the vain hope that they were going to get some click-throughs, so that people might see an ad when they do click through, or that perhaps it will drive subscriptions, but it probably won't. But the reality is, very often they're not clicking through. People are happy with just the headline in the first paragraph, so they're getting that from social media, and it's been created by these companies. And no wonder Meta has a market cap of $1.25 trillion, because they're selling advertising for content that other people create, whether it's either their users or the media.
Yeah, and the quality of journalism has gone down so much as a result of all that. So the last time and this is where WikiLeaks came in, because it used to be the case that newspapers would be trying to find some story like that. So the classic, of course, is Watergate, and the Watergate story is broken by the Washington Post from memory, and the two journalists in that were basically junior journalists, but they saw something about a robbery at the hotel, I think, the Watergate Hotel, and a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, and then they followed that story up. And without that, Watergate has become part of the background ethos of human civilization these days. Everything is gate. Did you see that Musk said that if there's ever a scandal about him, please call it Elon Gate?
So what part of him is he talking about there, I wonder? So the other thing is, there's also less consumption of news going on, and that's because, and I've got a theory on this as well. I mean, the reason that's very often given, there's been a lot of research into this, people saying, well, it's depressing, we can't cope with all that disaster, all that climate change, all that war, inflation, health issues. Every time you turn on the BBC these days, it's about how someone's got some sort of health issue, migrant crises, disasters. It's all so depressing. No wonder people are turning off, because there's less about what causes the problems and how to fix them, and more stories about just how awful it is
and how many problems there are.
Yeah, and I think it's the fact that there's not a constructive solution. We're going to have to come to a constructive solution for all the problems that we've talked about, by the way, because otherwise we'll be guilty as charged. But there's not a constructive element. But if there was, perhaps we'd all feel better and people would be more engaged. But the whole media business, because of this need for clickbait, has all been, have you seen this? It's awful. Rather than, have you seen this? I wonder why that happened, and here's a possible solution to it. Which, I used to think that was what made good talk radio, would be talking about solutions rather than talking about issues. But I was soon proven wrong on that, because the audience is there if you just talk about problems. They don't want they don't seem to want the solution. So maybe I'm arguing against myself, but I feel like if there was more of a resolution in the media, it wouldn't be quite so depressing, and therefore you'd engage more people.
Well, I think it's a large part of how the quality of political debate and decision making has been dumbed down in the last 40 years. Because again, when you had, like, if you look at what we used to be the Sydney Morning Herald's library, the research staff, in a sense, there weren't PhDs, but they were people who were dedicated to follow up stories, follow up leads, and so on. And like my most recent here, this is one reason I stopped writing to The Guardian, and it's not George Monbiot's fault. I'll add to that particular case. But when I discovered what economists have been doing on climate change and how tragically bad it was, I writing a paper called The Appallingly Bad Neoclassical Economics of Climate Change. And I was in touch with George, and he said, yes, send it to me and I'll report on it. I sent it to him and nothing happened. And that was one reason I got angry at The Guardian. I gave them what I regarded as a scoop not just of the century, possibly of the existence of human civilization. Economists who know bugger all about climate change had made up bullshit numbers that people were taking seriously in politics because they trusted economists to do the right thing, and I had it on paper and you could read it in the journals themselves. They hadn't done the right thing. They'd made up their own stupid numbers about climate change. George Monbiot clearly is interested in climate change. Surely George is the person to report on it. I send it to him, nothing happens. So I was getting progressively angry. That's one reason I dropped out of a couple of years later of subscribing to the Guardian. And then at one stage I finally got angry enough to put it on Twitter. So you'll find a tweet me criticising George Monbiot about this. And George wrote back as incredulous and said, I'm a freelancer. I don't have any research staff. I get hundreds of things like this. So he didn't realise how big my story was. He picked up one other of the feeds he was getting through people from Twitter and emails writing to him, and he wrote about that day, and mine fell by the wayside. Now, and that's not his fault. This is back to the point about...
No, there's a problem. There's a problem when you just employ freelancers because they're not sitting in an editorial meeting every day trying to decide what the big story is.
You don't have half a dozen people helping them out and say, hey, George, you should actually focus on this one. There was nobody doing the filtering. So the quality of ways we cover stories has been plunged by the failure of newspapers to develop that micropayment system, and they're never going to do it. I mean, I've given up on that.
I don't think it would have solved the problem. I really don't think it would solve the problem.
I think
disagree. It would do. I think it would. So I think the problem is more the case that we are not wedded to news in the same way. Particularly, there's a whole generation that are not wedded. So 40%. There's a research saying 40% of Americans avoid the news altogether. They're quite happy to be oblivious to what's going on in the world. So I don't know how you solve the problem. But the issue is, can news be a commercial business? And what happens when it's just not commercially viable anymore? And we're getting very close to those days. Well, 40% of Americans won't care too much if that's the case. But what about, what it does to society? Do we need to stick with public broadcasting, for example? Do we need to ramp that up and make sure that remains fiercely independent? And we can do that. But what happens if it's just creating media that no one is consuming? And if you say, well, it's got to be stuff that people consume, does that therefore mean you go down the clickbait road? Where's the balance?
Well, the only balance that I could see is if you had strong trade unions of journalists maintaining their integrity and being able to protect anybody who was potentially threatened by their news organisation, whether that's government-owned or privately. If they get excluded, then there's major consequences for the power relations. Ultimately, it's workers versus capitalists, yet again, and we'd have a far better system if the workers had more power and the capitalists had less. And that applies equally to when the state's involved and the state takes the place of the employer. Something like that is necessary, but it's not going to happen. Okay, we've lived through the decay and decline of media, and it's going to continue until such time as I think most media organisations simply won't exist. They'll just be broadcasting Snapchat photographs.
Or should Meta and the like should out of that vast wealth that they are creating, should they be taxed heavily to support media, to support news creation?
Something of that nature would, but then the power politics are never going to let that happen. So this is a bit like the way that I now one of my colleagues said we should think about climate change. It's not a problem, it's a predicament. Okay? And problems have solutions. Predicaments have consequences. And our consequence is we've been dumbed down at the very time we need to have far more detailed knowledge about the situation we find ourselves on this planet, in this ecosystem. And it's going to be a shock to everybody when it starts falling apart, because the sort of journalism, effectively I've done, high-quality journalism, pulling apart the papers of economists. That should have been in the Sunday Times. That should have been something we're all aware of, and not just when I first discovered it, but when the crap was first printed. We should have known about this 30 years ago. We don't, because we don't have journalists buying journals, reading them and saying, hey, this bloke this young economist over in Yale, this William Nordhaus, that's his name, he assumes that having a roof over your head is going to protect you from climate change. It's got to be a fool, hasn't he, Jack? Shouldn't we write a story about this lunatic? Now, if that had happened, he wouldn't have got the Nobel Prize. He would have been sacked, and that would be far better for humanity if that had happened. So we're suffering massively from the lack of quality journalism.
Yeah, which is a factor of, it doesn't mean that there's not good journalists. Well, there probably aren't that many, because people aren't going into that line of business because there's no end game. I mean, there's no money in it. I mean, I think the only way now you can make money, which is what I'm doing, which is, sort of like selling out, which is the podcast. Creating a podcast for a bank that pays me to. I mean, actually, this, it's pretty impartial, really. But it's, we're never going to say it's for the National Australia Bank. We're never going to say anything bad about NAB. If NAB did something wrong, I would studiously avoid talking about it. But
and the same thing applies. This is important. Let's extend the podcast a bit, because that's what I was interviewed on Russia Today all the time, and people say, "Oh, Russia Today, you can't say anything bad about Putin." I said, "No, so that's why I watch Al Jazeera or one of the others." So you would trust the news from Russia Today about everything except Russia. You trust the news about Al Jazeera about everything except the Arabic part of the world, not necessarily all of it, but you trust everything about Press TV about everything except Iran. You trust China about everything except China, and then by sampling that way and having a bit of skepticism, you could get an overall picture. That would be feasible. But so people simply put you down because you're on a particular outlet. How the hell else do you get an unorthodox thought out there? That's been my frustration for the last 20-something, 30 years. And I got, some coverage of my predictions of a financial crisis back in 2007 through the standard media. But, here I am on a far more important topic, climate change, and I can't even get into the bloody newspapers. So it's far worse now than it was even 15 years ago.
And I guess, you couldn't say anything bad about Murdoch on working for a Murdoch paper either, could you? So,
exactly. But in fact,
I did hear just a funny anecdote. I think it was Matt Chorley on Times Radio. Times obviously owned by Murdoch these days. This was a year ago, and they're talking about the latest series in Succession. Which, of course, is all about, it's not about the Murdochs, of course, but it is the Murdochs. Everyone knows that. And Matt Chorley just said, yes, that show that obviously is all about those very nasty people who run The Guardian. Which is his way of saying, yes, I know. So I thought that was quite clever. But anyway, look, we'll leave it there. So there's some glimmers of hope that there are people who are great and good in the media, but they are becoming few and far between. And sadly, I feel like we need, it's an area of market failure, isn't it? Pure and simple market failure.
Absolutely. That's the only way to do it was forget about the market. They're never going to solve it. It would have been workers, trade unions could have done something about it to maintain equality, but they've been decimated as well.
So you've got to spend public money on it, and then you've got to back away from it, and you've got to get over this problem where public broadcasters feel like they're treading on eggshells and they don't want to upset the incumbent government because they're their paymasters. You've got to get around that somehow. I mean, which you could do through editorial boards and, independent, you've supposedly got an independent regulator, which should stop that happening. But anyway, but we are going the other way with government spending less and less money on the media, and yet it's crucial to society, isn't it? Imagine if the BBC disappeared, what that would do to British society.
I think it's already happened, hasn't it?
Well, it sort of has, but I mean, there's bits of it left behind, and and it's part of the psyche of the country, same as the ABC is in Australia. If they disappear, then that's it's a very sad situation. So it's got to be part of the answer. Anyway, we solved nothing, Steve. We just depressed ourselves again.
Indeed, yeah. I'll go slash my wrist while I have breakfast.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Okay, I won't have breakfast.
Have a nice breakfast and read the paper. Just don't read the signal.
It's probably on the porch.
I don't know why you're in Australia at the moment. I have no idea what newspaper you'd read because they're all a bit crap now, aren't they? At least we've still got some good ones left in the UK. But the Sydney Morning Herald has just gone the way of Murdoch tabloids, hasn't it?
Relatively, not as bad as Murdoch, but nonetheless, yes.
It's gone a long way towards it. Anyway, all right, I'll leave you with breakfast and the Herald. See you soon.
See you, mate. Bye.
The Debunking Economics Podcast.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please share it with your friends, like it on YouTube, and subscribe to this channel.